In the last section, we uploaded our project up to pub, and now we're ready to make use of it on a new project that we're going to start inside this section. Now, before I start telling you about the app we're going to be building, a real quick note here. The next app that we're going to be building is 100% optional inside this course. So we're going to be building a command line utility. We'll talk about what it is in just a moment. But I want you to know that, yeah, we're getting a little bit far away from building mobile apps, which is really at the end of the day the point of this course. So if you're tired of these side topics and you really just want to get to the Flutter stuff, that's totally fine. Feel free to skip over this application. What we're going to be covering with this application is a little bit more on working with the file system on your local machine, working with asynchronous code, specifically something called futures, and also get a little bit more experience working with strings. So if none of these things look interesting, it's totally fine. You could pause right here, skip this app, and move on to the next section. Otherwise, stick around and we'll talk about what we're going to make. All right, so we're going to use the open source package we just put together to put together an image conversion utility. So we're going to be building a command line tool. When a user launches it, we're going to ask them a series of different questions in sort of a wizard format. We're going to first ask the user if they are here to convert an image. If they say yes, then we're going to move on to the second screen here. On the second screen, we're going to ask our user what type of format they want to convert an image to, and we'll list out either JPEG or PNG. Then on the third screen, and this is where things get interesting, we're going to look at all the images that exist in the user's current working directory. So in this example, I might have two images inside of my working directory, myimage.jpg and otherimage.png. A user can select one of these two images. So in this case, they might have selected 0 for my image JPG. After the user selects that image, we'll then run a file conversion process that will convert this JPEG image over to a PNG. After the conversion is complete, we'll then ask the user if they want to open up the newly created image file. So that's the tool. That's what we're going to be building. And I think you can kind of get an idea here of how we're going to have to work with the underlying file system to figure out what images are available for conversion. We're going to have to work with a little bit of asynchronous code for the actual image conversion process. And then finally, the working with strings part comes in as we start to try to figure out what different image files are in the current working directory that are valid for conversion, because we're only going to allow conversion between JPEG and PNG file types. All right, so that's the idea. Let's take a quick pause right here. We'll come back to the next section and get started on this new project. In the last section, we started talking about the next project that we're going to work on. So we're going to make an image conversion utility that makes use of that prompting library that we just put together and uploaded to pub. In this section, we're going to create our root project directory and get started with a little bit of default project setup. So to get started, I'm going to change over to my command line. You'll notice I've changed out to a working directory here. So I'm no longer inside of the prompter library folder. So once I'm outside in a more working directory location, I'll then make a new project folder. I'm going to call my project folder converter, like so. And then I'll change into that newly created folder. Once in here, I'll then start up my code editor. All right, so here's my code editor. And the first thing we're going to do is set up our pubspec.yaml file. Remember that pubspec file is the core place of configuration of our project. We used that file in the last couple of videos to set up some configuration to be able to upload our project to pub. Now in this case, we're not going to upload this project to pub, but we still have to create this pubspec file in order to install a couple of dependencies to our project. So inside of my root project directory, I'm going to create a pubspec.yaml file. Then inside this newly created file, we'll put down a couple of the fields that we had used previously as well. So we're going to place a name of simply converter. I'll do a description of something like a tool for image conversion. And I'll set up my version of 001. Now, like I just said, we use our pubspec file not only for putting in some information about our project, but we can also use it to install dependencies. Dependencies like the one that you and I just created in the last couple of videos, that prompting library. So to install that prompting library into this newly created project, we're going to add on a dependencies section. And then inside of here, we'll list out all the different dependencies that our project requires to work properly. So the first dependency that we're going to install is the prompting library that we just created. So I'm going to write out the name of my prompting library, which for me was prompter_sg. Now remember, it's incredibly likely that you named your project something else, something besides prompter_sg. So you will want to use your project name right here for the prompting library that we just put together and uploaded to pub. Then after our colon, we'll list out the version of this library that we want to install. So we only created one single version of the prompting library, and that was version 001. All right, so you should have 001 right here. Now on my file alone, I'm going to make a tiny change. I'm going to get version 002 for prompter_sg. That is only because I created a second version of this thing just for the purposes of this course. So you want 001, I'm going to use 002 simply because I uploaded a second version for this course. No other reason. All right, so that's it for this file. Now that we've listed out our dependency inside of here, we're going to flip back over to our command line and run a command that's going to look at the dependencies we listed inside this file and attempt to install them. So back at my terminal, inside of my newly created converter directory, I'll run the command pub get. So that's going to attempt to install that dependency that we just listed inside that file, and we're pretty much good to go. Okay, so that's pretty much it for installing dependencies, at least the single dependency that we need right now. So let's take a quick pause, we'll come back to the next section, and we'll get started working on our project. In the last section, we created a pubspec.yaml file and added our prompter library as a dependency. Now that we've got this little bit of setup put together, we can start thinking about some of the code that we're going to need to write inside of this app. So the first thing I want to remind you about is our file and folder structure that we had used previously, specifically for that library project that we put together. So for our library project of the prompting library, we had our lib folder with all of our application-specific code, and then we had the example folder with an example of how to use our library. Now in this case, we are building a command line application or a command line utility. We are not building an actual library. So because our project type has changed, our file and folder structure is going to change slightly as well. So instead of this example directory, we're going to instead have something called the bin directory. The bin directory is going to contain a single file called main.dart. This main.dart file right here is going to contain all the code meant to interact directly with our command line, ask questions to our user, and generally implement logic around making our program run. We're still going to have a lib directory, and inside this lib directory will be a variety of different helper files that make our main.dart file work the way we expect. Now, we'll get a better sense of what code goes where inside of our project, but for right now, all we really need to understand is that we're going to create a bin directory, and that bin directory is going to house the main entry point into our application. So let's create this bin directory right now, and then make the main.dart file inside there. So back inside my code editor, I'm going to make a new folder of bin, and then inside there, I'll make a new file of main.dart. And this really is the main entry point to our application. And remember, every Dart app that we create has to have a main function. That main function is the first one that gets executed when our program initially runs. So inside of main.dart, I'll write out my main function, and I'm going to make sure that I annotate the main function with the return type of void to say that this function returns nothing at all. So now inside this main function, we can start to implement the flow of our application. We want to ask our user if they are here to convert an image, and then select the format and all the other steps inside here. So at this point, all we really have to do is import our prompting library and then use it to ask our user some questions. So at the top, we will import the prompting library we just created. To import that library, we'll write out import package, a colon, and then the name of our package, which is prompter_sg. I'll then put a // and then specify the actual file that I want to import from that package. When you put the slash right here, whatever file name you list out to the right of that is going to be the file that you want to import directly from the lib directory of that project. So if you recall, back over in our prompting library, and I still have that code editor open, here we go right here. So here's our prompting library. Inside of our lib directory, we had created a file called promptersg.dart, or whatever your project name was, .dart. So inside of here, inside that lib directory, we want to get the promptersg.dart file. Now, quick reminder, remember, I can't say it enough, you probably named your project something different than promptersg. So rather than putting promptersg right here, you're going to want to put the name of your project. So now that we've got that import, we can freely make use of code that has been exported from our library. In our prompter file back over here, we had exported our prompter class and the option class as well. So we can now use the prompter class to create a new instance of a prompter inside of our application, and then use it to ask questions to our user. So for example, we could say final prompter equals new prompter. And then we could ask our users a binary question. Specifically, this one right here, to ask whether or not our user is here to convert an image. So we can do something like prompter.askBinary, and then the question we want to ask. Are you here to convert an image? And I'll collapse this over here so you can see the whole line. And that's pretty much it. So here's a great example of how we can easily reuse code between different projects that we put together. We published our package up to pub, we installed it to this new project, we imported it at the top with the import statement, and then we were able to freely reference the code inside of our library inside this new project. We can now flip back over to our terminal and attempt to run this new main.dart file. So back at my terminal, I'm going to change into my bin directory. So there's the main.dart file, and then we can run dart main.dart, and we get asked if we want to convert an image. In this case, I'll say sure. Now we don't have anything else going on after that, but hey, we're definitely making progress here. So let's take a quick break, and we'll continue with some more implementation in the next section. In the last section, we were able to import our prompting library and then easily ask our users a simple question of whether or not they were here to convert an image. At present, we're not really doing anything with that information. In other words, if we run that file and enter in no, well, we exit, and if we enter in yes, we exit as well. So in this section, we're going to look at the feedback that the user provides us and use that to decide whether to continue in our flow. That's going to take the user to the next screen over here, or whether we should simply exit our user back to the terminal. All right. So back inside my code editor, I'm going to find the question that we're asking right here. If you hover over that ask binary function right here, you'll recall that we get back a Boolean from the ask binary function. And that Boolean says either yes, the user answered truthfully, or they answered false. So we're going to take whatever value gets returned here, and I'm going to assign it to a value that I'll call, choice, like so. And then after that, we'll set up a simple if statement. And we'll say if the user answered falsy, so if not choice, then we need to do something inside of here that's going to simply exit the user away from our program, essentially kick them out of this flow and not allow them to progress to the next screen. So in order to forcibly exit our user from our program, we could, in theory, simply return. If we return from our main function, the program exits. But in this case, we probably want to do a little bit more forceful exiting of our program. We really want to make sure that the user truly gets completely kicked out. In order to do so, we're going to be using a function that is included in one of the Dart standard library modules. So I'm going to quickly pull up my Dart documentation here that we've looked at many times. On the left-hand side, under the VM section, I'm going to find Dart:/IO. And then on the right-hand navigation section, I'll scroll down real far down to functions listing right here. And I'll look at the exit function. So the exit function allows us to immediately exit the process that we're running with some given exit code. The exit code is our ability to kind of report back to the operating system whether or not something went wrong with a program that we just executed. In our case, if the user says, yes, I want to exit, or they say, I guess it'd be more accurate to say, no, I'm not here to convert an image, well, nothing necessarily went wrong with our program, so we could exit with an exit code of 0, which indicates to our operating system that nothing went wrong as we were running this program. So in order to use this exit function, we have to first import the IO package that it belongs to, and then we can simply call exit with an exit code of 0. So back inside my code editor, I'll go up to the top of the file and add an import for Dart CLI. And then inside my if statement, if a user says, no, I am not here to convert an image, then I will call exit and pass in 0. Okay. So let's flip back over to our terminal and test this out. Back inside of my bin directory, I'll run dart main.dart, and then I'll answer, no, I'm not here to convert an image. And just as before, I get kicked back to the terminal or the command prompt. So it might seem like nothing's really changed, but we have specifically said that we want to exit our program, and when we exited, nothing really went wrong. The reason that we're using exit of 0 right here, by the way, rather than simply saying return, is that if we ever decide to move this little question right here into a helper function, then the return keyword might not really do what we expect anymore. So by putting in exit 0, we are forcibly saying, that's it, we're done, nothing else to do here. Okay, so good progress. Let's take a quick pause right here, and we'll continue in the next section. In the last section, we added in a check to make sure that our user truly wants to convert an image. So now if a user gets past this if statement, it means, yep, they probably want to convert an image, and we should continue by asking another question to our user. So we now want to ask a question to understand what type of format the user wants to convert the image to. So we want to present two possible choices. A user should either be able to convert an image to a JPEG or a PNG. Now, I'm sure you recall exactly how we might put this question together right here. We're going to use our prompting library to ask a multiple choice question. So back inside my code editor, after our if statement, I'm going to add in a prompter.askMultiple because we want to ask a multiple choice question. For the question that we ask, we're going to say select format, and then we'll list out all the different possible options that they can select from. Remember that whenever we ask a multiple choice question, we pass in a list of option objects. And if you hover over ask multiple right here, you'll get a really good reminder of that. So we get list, and that's a list of option objects. Now we could certainly create that list of objects right here, but instead, maybe we should create a little helper function that will assemble all the different possible format options that a user could select. So I'm going to make a helper function called build format options, and then we'll add that function inside of our main.dart file. So I'll say build format options, and I'm going to annotate the return type of this function as being a list of option type objects. So now inside of here, we can assemble that list. So I'm going to return a list, and then we can freely write out all the different options that we'd want. So I want a new option for converting to JPEG. So I'll give the option a label of convert to JPEG. And I think we're doing the long form JPEG. And then as the value that we'll designate here, we'll pass in simply the type of image that the user wants to convert this to. So I'll say JPEG like so. Then as the second option, we'll do convert to PNG, and we'll pass in PNG. Remember that the second argument to these option constructors right here is kind of like the data that we want to get returned. So if a user selects convert to JPEG, well, we could definitely parse this string right here and detect that, yeah, they selected the option with JPEG, but remember we set up this entire system to instead allow you and I to get back a single argument that says, here's some data that represents the choice that was just selected. So in our case, getting back a string that says simply JPEG is going to make our life easier because we'll know the exact extension that the user expects to see. Okay, so we're now getting our build format options function, and we're asking that multiple choice question. So let's do another quick test here. Back inside my bin directory, I'll do dart main.dart. I then get asked if I'm here to convert an image. I'll say yes, and I'll say, yeah, I want to convert to JPEG. Cool, looks good. Okay, let's take another quick pause right here, and we'll continue in the next section. In the last section, we successfully asked our users what type of format they want to convert their image into. Now we're just asking our user what selection or what format they want to convert right now, and we're not actually saving their response. So we're going to take the result of this ask multiple call right here, and we're going to save it to a variable that we'll call format. So now format will always be either JPEG or PNG right here, one or the other. So we can now use this format variable later on to figure out exactly what type of format we want to convert our image into. All right, so that pretty much wraps it up for our second question right here. And we're now going to move on to our third question, where we select the file that we want to convert. This is going to be a little bit harder question to put together, so we'll spend a little bit of time figuring out exactly how it's going to work. Let's first flip back over to our code editor, and we'll write out the code to ask the user the question. And then we'll think a little bit about how we're going to build the list of possible options that the user can select. So underneath our ask multiple question right here, I'll do another prompter.ask multiple, and we'll ask our user select an image to convert. And then to build our list of options, I'm going to make another helper function called build file options, like so. So this is going to be a helper function that returns a list of option objects. Let's define that function right now. At the bottom of the file, I'll define build file options. We're calling this function and passing it to the second argument of ask multiple, which means build file options right here must return a list of option objects. So I'll put in that return type annotation right there. All right, so build file options is going to be a little bit complicated just because we have a lot of logic that we have to execute inside of here. Let's first begin by writing out a couple of comments that are going to help guide our implementation of this function. So the first thing we have to do inside of here is get a reference to the current working directory. Anytime a user runs our command line interface utility to convert these images, we're going to attempt to find all the images in the current working directory. So in other words, the same folder that the user runs our program from at the terminal. So if I ran our program from this bin folder right here, we would want to look inside of this bin folder and find all the different images inside there. So that's definitely going to be step number one. Step number two will be to find all the files and folders in this directory. So simple enough, we wanted to look inside that directory and find all the different files and folders inside there. Now it might seem like we don't really care about the folders, and that's totally accurate. We don't really care about the folders at all. But unfortunately, when we're working with Dart, when we want to look inside of a folder and find all the contents, we get just one function that tells us about both the files and the folders. So we have to find all the things that are inside this current directory and then somehow iterate through them and find only the image files. So after we get all the files and folders in that directory, we'll look through that list and find only the images. Once we find those images, remember at the end of the day we have to return a list of option objects. So then the last step that we have to do inside of here is take all the images and create an option object out of each. So one of our option objects where we have a label to it and then an actual value as the second argument. Okay, so that's the idea. Let's take a quick pause right here. We'll come back to the next section and get started with our implementation. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we wrote out a couple of comments in this build file options function to guide us through the implementation. So the first thing we have to do is get a reference to the current working directory. Let's take a look at our Dart documentation, and we'll see if there's any helper functions over there that are going to help us out with this step. Okay, so over at my Dart documentation, I'll find the Dart IO package. Then on the right-hand side, I'm going to find a class called directory. Here it is right here. And then on the directory class, I'm going to scroll down to the very bottom, to the section that says static properties. And then on there, I'll find the current property. All right, so the current property right here gives us a reference to the current working directory, or in other words, the folder that our program is being executed from. So all we have to do is reference this directory class and then reference the current property. And that will give us an object that will tell us a little bit more about the current working directory. So back inside of here, inside my build file options, I'm going to create a new variable called current directory, and it's going to be directory.current. And I'll mark that as being final. Now I wrote out directory right here, and I was able to because we've already imported the IO package at the top. So because we imported IO right here, we imported everything that the IO package provides. And one of the things that it provides is the directory class. And on the directory class is this static current property thing right here. The word static property means that we don't have to create an instance of the directory class to access that property. So static means you can reference this property at any time, and you don't have to create an instance of the object ahead of time. Okay, so this gives us a reference to the current directory, and now we can use this reference to find all the files and folders inside that directory. So let's take a look at the documentation for this directory type right here and figure out how we can get a list of all the files and folders. So again, at the directory class, I'm going to find a function inside the method section right here called listSync. When we call listSync, it's going to return to us a list of something called a file system entity. Now this is the part where I'd said things are a little bit confusing in the Dart world. So in the last section I said that we're going to find all the files and folders inside that directory. When we call this listSync method right here, we get back this file system entity type. This is meant to represent some entity or something that exists inside this directory. It might be a file or it might be a folder. We don't really know. And it's up to us to somehow iterate through all these file system entity objects and find only the image files that we care about and completely disregard other file types and disregard folders as well. So on this current directory object, we're going to call current directory listSync, and then we'll save the result to a variable that we'll call entities. So entities, again right here, it's going to be a list of file system entity objects, and they might represent files or folders. We have no idea until we iterate through it and find only the records that we actually care about. Now I think at this point, we should probably do a little bit of a test just to make sure this is working the way we expect. So right now, I'm going to do a print of entities, and we'll get a better idea of what's going on there. Now at this point, you'll notice that we are still not returning a list of option objects. So if we ran our code as is right now, we would probably see an error message. So rather than seeing that error message by running this ask multiple right here and running build file options, I'm going to comment out that entire line. And then right underneath it, I'm going to call simply build file options by itself and do nothing else. Okay, so let's test this out. Back over inside my bin directory, I'll do my dart main.dart. I want to convert an image. We'll take it to JPEG, and we get listed out our file system entity list right here. And so in this case, we have one file inside the working directory, and it is that main.dart file. Okay, so that looks good. Inside this working directory, yep, in fact, we have only that one file. So it looks like we are, in fact, correctly finding all the different files and folders, or at least the different files right now, inside this bin directory. So let's take a quick pause right here. We'll continue in the next section, and we'll figure out how we're going to somehow find only the image files inside this directory. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we were able to access our current working directory and list out all the different files and folders that were inside there. We now need to look through that list and find only the image files that we actually care about. So if it is a file that ends with a Dart extension, or if it's a folder, or if it's a file that ends with a text extension, we don't care about those. All we care about are image files and nothing else. So to get started, I'm going to first clean up this print statement that we had before. And then underneath the comment that says that we're going to look through that list and find only the images, we'll add on a little bit of code right here to iterate through that entities list and look at every single entry inside there. Now to iterate through that list, we could definitely write out a for loop. That's definitely an option. But with Dart, we get a lot of helpers that keep us from having to write that really repetitive logic of for loops. So let's take a look at the documentation for list objects one more time, and we'll see if there isn't some function in there that's going to help us with what we're trying to do here, which is to find only image files. So I've already pulled up the documentation for the list class. Remember, you can get here by going to the Dart documentation, going to the Dart core module, and then finding the list class. At the list class, I'll find the right-hand panel, and I'll scroll down to the where method. So all the way down here at the bottom, where. So with the where method, we can call where and we pass in a function that gets called with every element inside of our list. We can then return a Boolean of either true or false. If we return true, then we will include this record inside of some output list. If we return false, then it gets discarded. So you can kind of think of this where method as being like a filter of sorts. So back over inside my code, we're going to look at our list of entities, and we'll call .where, and we'll pass in a function that's going to be called with every element inside of the entities list. So I will receive that single record as entity, and then we're going to add in a little bit of logic to either return true if this is an image file, or false if it is not. So remember, inside this list, we have both files and folders. The first thing that we're going to look at here is we're going to get a better sense of whether we are working with a file or a folder. So the first thing we'll do is kind of separate files versus folders, and then once we know that we're working with a file, we'll then come back and get a better sense of whether or not it's an image file or some other type that we don't care about. So we have to first figure out whether or not entity is a file or a folder. For that, we'll go and take a look at the documentation for our file system entity type again. So remember, when we called list sync, we got back a list of file system entity objects. So if I look at my file system entity, here it is right here, and on the properties section over here, we can scroll down to the bottom and find static methods. One static method that we have access to is isFileSync right here. So we can call isFileSync, we can pass in a path to some file, and that will return back to us and tell us whether or not this is actually a file or a folder. Or to be more precise, it's going to return a Boolean. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that this isFileSync method right here is a static method. And again, a static method, much like a static property, means we do not need to make a new instance of the file system entity class before we call this method. We can just reference file system entity, which is a part of the IO package, and directly call isFileSync without trying to create a new instance of this class. All right, so all that means to say is that inside this where statement, we will say file system entity dot isFileSync, and then we need to pass in the path to the entity that we're currently looking at. So the path of this entity object right here is entity.path, like so. All right, so this is going to return true if we are working with a file, false if we're working with a folder. We do have to remember to put in our return statement right here. And okay, I think that's good to go. Now at present, I want you to notice that we're calling entities.where. When we call this where method on a list, it does not modify the original list. Instead, it creates a brand new list that contains only the records that passed our little test right here. So in theory, what we really want to do now is say like entities equals this new list that we just produced. But we marked entities up here as being final, which means we can't reassign the variable. Now, certainly we could definitely mark this thing with var, which allows us to reassign it, but if you think about it, well, we're really just going to be kind of processing this list over and over again. and so I'm not sure that we really need to reassign to entities over and over. Instead, I think that we can just call list sync right here, and then we can chain on .where directly to that, and not have to deal with this entities function at all, or this entities variable at all. So I'm going to do a little bit of code cleanup here. I'm going to take out this comment to start. I'm going to take out entities equals entities and leave just the .where. Then I'm going to remove the semicolon on the line above it. And then finally, we do not really need this variable declaration anymore, so I'm going to take it out entirely. And now we're left with just this like so. So we're now saying look at the current directory, list out all the files inside there, and then do some filtering over that list. Now when you look even at what we have here, well, we're looking at current directory. Do we actually need that variable? I think same thing, we don't really need that variable either. So we're going to clean up this current directory variable as well, and just look at directory.current, call list sync on that, and then call .where on the result of that. So I'm going to remove the current directory variable. I'm going to remove the comment above it. I'm going to remove the semicolon at the end of this line, and then I'm going to remove the final current directory up here as well. And now we're left with something far, far cleaner and much straightforward with far less code. So now we're looking at the current directory, listing out everything inside there, looking at all the entities inside there, and returning only the files that, or only the entities that are files. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Let's save this right here, and we'll come back to the next section and continue adding on to our little where statement. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a moment. In the last section, we added a lot of logic to our build file options function. So we're now looking at the current directory, getting our file system entities, and then doing a little bit of filtering on that list. But right now, we're only trying to look through that list and find the different files inside there. We still have to make sure that the files that we get back are actually image files and not any other type. In other words, we don't want to accidentally try to convert a Dart file over to like a JPEG file. That doesn't quite make sense, and it's probably going to throw a big error inside of our program. So rather than just checking to see if we are working with a file right here, I'm going to remove the semicolon at the end of that line, and I'm going to add on an AND statement. So I'll put on my Boolean operator for AND, and on the right-hand side of that, we're going to do an additional check. We're going to look to see if the entity that we're working with is a file or is an image file type. Now there's no function inside of the Dart standard library that tells us if we are working with a image file type. Instead, it's up to you and me to be a little bit clever in deciding whether or not this is a file or not. So for our program, we're going to say that if a file has the extension of .png or .jpeg, then we're just going to assume that yes, this is in fact an image file. So if our file ends with .jpeg or .png, that's it, we're good to go. We're going to consider this to be an image file. So on the right-hand side of the AND right here, we're going to again look at the entity's path variable. The path variable includes the actual file name. So we'll do entity.path, which is going to return the entire file name. That file name is going to be a string. So inside that string, we'll call contains, and let's put this on a new line just so we can see what's going on here. There we go. We'll call contains, and to this contains function, we can pass in a regular expression. A regular expression allows us to do a search inside of the entity path variable right here and determine whether or not it contains some particular string that we're looking for. So to contains, I'm going to pass in new reg expression or reg xp, and then inside there, I'll pass in an actual regular expression. To create a regular expression in Dart, we add r and then a set of quotes, and then we put our actual regular expression inside here. So the regular expression we're going to use is we're going to say, look for a dot followed by a PNG or a JPG or JPEG, like so. So if our file entity has a .png, a .jpeg, or a .jpeg, then we're going to consider this to be an image file. Okay, so that's pretty much it. So now we're looking through all of our entities. We're looking for only folders, and then only files, and then out of those files, we are trying to make sure that the file has a .png or a .jpeg in its name. So that's looking pretty good. Let's take a quick pause right here. And then in the next section, the last thing we have to do is take all these images that we've now found and create an option object out of each one. So quick break, and we'll take care of that in the next section. The last thing we have to do inside of our build file options function is look through all the file system entities that have passed the first check right here of making sure it's a file and making sure it's an image file at that, and turn each one into an option object that can then be fed into our prompter ask multiple function. Now again, from where right here, we get back a new list of records, and that list of records only contains objects that pass this check right here. So we're going to map over that list. I'm going to chain on a .map function right here, and we'll pass in a function that's going to be called with every file system entity that is passed our initial check. And for every file system entity, we're going to craft a brand new option object. So I'm going to receive entity, and then we're going to eventually return a new option object. Now the arguments to the option object that we're going to craft right here are going to be just a little bit challenging. So as the first argument to the option, we're going to pass in the label that we want to actually appear at our terminal. So essentially that first argument needs to be the actual file name of like myimage.jpg or other image.png or whatever it might be. So to actually get a file name out of this file system entity right here is a little bit more troublesome than you might think. The reason for that is that on our file system entity class, there's not actually any property or any function inside of here that returns just the file name. You can take a look at this thing, and you're going to see that there's really nothing in here that returns just the file name. All we can really get access to is the path to this file. So we can get the file system path by itself, but that contains the entire path to the file, including all the directories that it's nested inside. So we need to somehow take that entire big long path and extract just the name by itself. All right, so let's flip back over to our code editor, and we'll get a better sense of how to do this. So I'm going to first make a variable called file name, and to that we're going to add a little bit of logic right here to look at our entity's path property and extract just the file name by itself. So we definitely know that we probably need to do entity.path like so. Now the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to split the path by /. So if we have a path of something like, I don't know, users Steven my images.myimage.jpg, when we call entity.path split, that's going to return back a list to us that has just each separate directory inside of a list, like so. So my images and then my image.jpg. So then inside the list that gets returned from the split call right here, we want just the last record. The last record inside there is going to be our actual file name. So I will call .last on there. Okay, so this might look like it works out pretty well, but there's actually a very subtle bug inside of here. When we split by /, that's going to work on paths that use /s or on file systems that use /s to designate nested folders. Unfortunately, if you're on Windows, Windows uses backslashes. So if you're on Windows, you would have something like C /my documents, my image.jpg, something like that instead. So clearly the code that we have right here is not going to work on Windows. It's only going to work correctly on Mac OS and Linux as well. In order to get a better separator in here, we could either check to see what operating system we're on, or we can make use of a built-in helper that is included with Dart to take care of all this kind of like file separator stuff for us automatically. So rather than splitting by /, we will split by platform.path separator. Platform.path separator is a property that is automatically created for us. Path separator in particular is going to look at our current operating system and it will contain either a / or a / depending upon the operating system we are running our program on. So in other words, this line of code right here is going to behave properly whether or not we are on Windows, Mac OS, or Linux. Okay, so I'm going to clean up all this path stuff down here at the bottom. So now, when we create our new option object right here, we'll pass in the file name as the label that will be displayed to the user, and then as the second argument, or as the thing that's going to eventually be returned to you and I if a user selects this option, we will return the entity, or kind of the object that represents this file on our hard drive. All right, so now just one last thing here. We need to make sure that out of this entire statement, we eventually return a list of option objects. So I'm going to make sure I mark this thing with the return keyword. And then one other very subtle thing to be aware of here, when we call map, we actually get back a type of iterable, which is technically not a list. So to actually take the result of the map function right here and actually convert it to a list object, after we call map, I'm going to add on one more function call and call toList, like so. All right, and I'm going to clean up some of these comments that we probably don't need. And I think that's about it. Okay, so let's take a quick pause right here, and in the next section, we'll test out this build file options function. In the last section, we finished up our build file options function, and now we need to actually test it out. But before we can test it, we need some actual image files that we can put into our current working directory that we can actually work around with and convert between PNG and JPEG. So I'm going to get started by going back over to my terminal, and I'm going to open up my bin directory. So we need to make sure that we get some image files placed inside of here so we can run our program and test to make sure that it works the way we expect. To get a couple of image files, I'm just going to go over to Dart image, or excuse me, not Dart, but Google image search at images.google.com. And then once over here, you can look for anything you want. I'll look for forest myself. I can then click on an image. So here's one right here. I can right click on it, and then I can do a save image as. And then I can save this image anywhere on my machine. So in my case, I'll just put it on my desktop. And now I can go over to my desktop. I'll copy that image that I just downloaded and put it into my bin directory. So now right next to my main.dart file, I've got maxresdefault.jpg. So now if we run our program from within this directory, I would expect to see an option for maxresdefault, but not an option for main.dart. So we need to make one more quick change before we actually test this out. Back inside of our code editor, remember we are calling build file options directly right here. So I'm going to remove that call and then uncomment the line where we try to ask our user to select an image to convert. Okay, so I'll save this. We'll flip back over to our terminal. I'm still inside my bin directory, and I'll run dart main.dart. Okay, so we are here to convert an image. We'll say yes. I want to convert this to a PNG. And now we get asked to select an image to convert, and I do in fact see only the image file appear here. Awesome. So this is definitely working the way we expect. Let's take a quick pause right here. We'll come back in the next section and we'll get a better sense of how to actually take this image file that's selected by the user and convert it over to a PNG type image. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we were able to test out our ability to list images to the user and allow them to select one. So now anytime that we call ask multiple right here, this function is going to eventually return an object of type file system entity. And so that's going to tell us exactly what image file the user wants to convert. So I'm going to make sure that I save that object that gets returned from this as a variable that I will call, how about selected file, like so. Okay, so that looks good. We now know the target format that the user wants to convert this thing to, and we also know exactly what file the user wants to convert. So now the last thing for us to do is figure out how to actually convert the image itself. To do so, we're going to take a look at some documentation for a package over on pub. So I'm going to open my browser back up, and I'm going to navigate to pub.dartlang.org. And then once here, I'll search for a package called simply image. I'll then find the first result. All right, here we go. The image package is a package that, as you might guess, allows us to very easily work with images. So we can use this package to convert images, to resize them, or to change quality around them, or just essentially otherwise manipulate images using Dart code. We're going to take a look at some of the API documentation, which you can find a link to over here on the right-hand side. And so I'm going to click on API docs right there. And then on the left-hand side, I'll click on the image library. And there we go. Inside this image library, you're going to find a ton of different classes and different functions. And so I want to point out the very specific functions that you and I are going to be making use of. So, quick diagram. We're going to take that file system entity object that was just returned when a user made a selection. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that the file system entity object is really just a reference to a file. And this object doesn't actually know about the contents of the file in any way, shape, or form. Well, of course, the image library needs to know about the contents of that image file. So the first thing we're going to do is read the contents of this file system entity, and then we're going to take that raw image file, or that raw image data, and we're going to pass it to a function that belongs to the image package called decode image. Decode image takes some very raw image information, and then it returns a class of type image. And we can actually go back over to the documentation over here. On the right-hand side, you can find the classes section, and you can scroll down a little bit and find the class image right here. So that's what gets returned when we call this initial function of decode image. And again, that's coming from the image package. Once we get back that instance of image, we then have access to two different functions that we can use to convert the image to some target file type. So we can call either encode PNG to convert it to a PNG, or we can call encode JPG to, as you might guess, convert it to a JPEG. So that's the idea. Now, real quickly, I want to take a look at the documentation for these three functions that we're going to make use of. So back inside of the documentation, I'm going to go to the right-hand nav over here, and I'm going to scroll way down and find the functions section right here. So the first function that we care about is the decode image function. So I'm going to click on the documentation for it. So if we pass in some raw image data, then we're going to get back an instance of class image. This is what we're going to use as kind of the entry point into the entire image library. This is like the very core class that we use to make use of all of the different image manipulation and conversion abilities that the library has. Okay, so that's decode image. Now I'm going to go back, and I'm going to again scroll down on the right-hand side to the function section, and I'm going to find encode JPG and encode PNG. So these both do the same thing. They take some image file and convert it to some output image type. So here's the encode PNG function. You can see that it takes as the primary argument an instance of image, and it's going to return some very raw image data. So that's then going to be up to you and me to take that raw image data, create a new file on our hard drive, and save the image back to the hard drive. Okay, so that's pretty much it. That's how we do this. So the last thing we need to do is make sure that we install this image library into our project. So to do so, I'm going to flip back over to my code editor. Inside of my project directory, I'm going to find the pubspec.yaml file. And then we're going to add another record to our dependencies section. So I'm going to specify that we want the image package, and then I'm going to use the most up-to-date version that is listed on pub. So let me go back here very quickly. So for me, the most up-to-date version is 2.04. So that's the version that I'm going to use. It's 2.0.4. If you see a newer version of image, that's totally fine. The API around the image package is very stable. And so if you're working with the newer version, chances are they're just little bug fixes or little tweaks and stuff like that. But in general, working with the package is very likely going to be very similar. Okay, so I'm going to save this file. When I do, VS Code is going to automatically try to download all the packages that I now have listed inside of here. And of course, if you don't see this thing pop up, you can always flip back over to your terminal. And then inside of the root project directory, we can run dart packages git, like so. Now, for me, I think that I'm inside the wrong directory here. Oh, no, I'm not. Let's double check that really quickly. Excuse me, wrong command, pub git, not dart packages git. Okay, there we go. All right, so quick break right here, and we'll continue in the next section. In the last section, we added the image library into our project. So we're now going to wire this thing up by writing a little bit of code to essentially put this flow together. We want to take that file system entity, we want to read all the data out of it, pass it to decode image, and then either encode it as a PNG or a JPG, and then save it back to our hard drive. Now, as a quick reminder, to generally organize our project, we put all the code related to the actual CLI running inside of our main.dart file. But if we end up having any kind of helper functions or any kind of helper operations that we might need, we'll usually put them inside of a lib.src file that we might name like, other thing or whatever it is in particular. So I'm going to flip back over to my code editor, and I'm going to create a new folder inside my root project directory that I'm going to call lib. Root project directory. There we go. So make sure that lib folder gets inside the root project directory and not inside of bin. Then inside of lib, I'm going to make another new folder called src. And finally, inside of there, I'll make a new file that we will call converter.dart. And so as you might guess, this file is going to house all the code that we need to convert the actual image file. We'll first begin by doing a couple of imports at the top of the file. So without a doubt, I'm definitely going to need the Dart IO package so that we can work with a file off of our hard drive. And I think that I'll also need the package that we just installed. So I'll do import package image.dart, like so. Okay, so you'll notice that this has a little, okay, there we go. There's a little error there. I was going to say that's probably an error that shouldn't be there. It just took my editor a little bit of time to catch up. So now inside of here, we're going to add in a new function that is going to essentially walk us through this flow. It's going to take some selected image file. It's going to read everything out of there. It's going to decode the image and then either encode PNG or encode JPG. So I'm going to name a file inside of here. How about convert image? We'll say that this will be called with a file system entity that we will call selected file. So of course that's going to be the file that the user is trying to pick. And then it will also be called with the format that we want to convert this image to. And as a quick reminder, the format is going to be a string. So that's going to be the ask multiple right here. We're going to get back either the string JPG or PNG. So I'm going to receive that as a second argument that's going to be a string that I will call simply format, like so. All right, so let's take a quick pause right here. We'll come back to the next section, and we're going to start to read out the contents of this file and then pass it into the decode image function from the image library. In the last section, we defined our convert image function, which receives our selected file and the target format. So we now need to take the selected file right here, and we need to read out the actual image that is stored inside that file. Again, remember, a file system entity is just a reference to a file on the hard drive. It doesn't actually represent the contents of the file. So let's take a look at some documentation and get a better sense of how we can read out the contents of selected file. I've got my documentation for api.dart lying open right here, and I'm taking a look at the file system entity class. Now, a file system entity, again, it represents a file, a directory, or a symbolic link to some object on our hard drive. At present, we are pretty darn sure that our file system entity represents an actual file that the user has selected. And so rather than looking at the documentation for file system entity, I'm actually going to go and look at the file class instead. And you'll see why in just a second. So I'm going to go back out to the Dart IO library, and then I'll find the file class over here on the right-hand side. So once we have an object of type file, then we can scroll down. We can find the method section on here. So here's methods. And if I keep going, you'll see that there is a function called readAsBytesSync. And so this reads the contents of the file and then returns it as a list of bytes. This is the data that the image library is going to expect to receive. Now, of course, the only issue is that that function belongs to the file class, not the file system entity class. So in order to make use of that function tied to the file class, here's what we're going to do. Back inside of our function over here,
you and I are darn sure that selected file is really a file and not a file system entity. So we are going to convince Dart of that fact by writing out selected file as file, like so. This essentially tells Dart that, hey, you know what, Dart, we know that you think this is a file system entity, but trust us, this really is a file. So just treat it as though it were a file. So Dart's going to see this and it's going to say, okay, sure, I can believe that. Yeah, that looks like a file to me. Good enough. So by writing out as file, we can now get access to all the methods that are normally on a file class. So I'm going to wrap that expression with some parentheses, and then on the result of it, you'll notice that my autocomplete kicks in here. And if I scroll down a little bit, we get access to that read as bytes sync method, which of course belongs to the file class, not the file system entity class. So I'm going to call read bytes as sync, and then I'm going to store that on a variable that I will call, how about raw image, like so. Okay, so that looks good. So now the next thing we're going to do, we have the raw image right here. This is the raw image data. We're now going to feed it into that decode image function that belongs to the image package. So I'm going to call on the next line decode image, and I'll pass in the raw image file. I'll then take the result of that function call and I'll assign it to a variable that I will call simply image. So now this right here is an object of type image. Again, this is an instance of the image class. This is implemented and created by the image package. Okay, so that looks good. Let's take another quick break and we'll continue in the next section. In the last section, we were able to read in the contents of our image file and then decode that image. So we've now got this instance of class image to work with. So we now need to decide whether we want to call encode PNG or encode JPG. And then quick reminder, one other thing that we have to do on here that's not reflected on this diagram, we have to make sure that at some point in time, we also take that newly created image and save it back to our hard drive. Let's first do the simple thing and attempt to either call encode PNG or encode JPG, depending upon the format variable that was tossed into this thing as an argument. So I'm going to say if format is equal to JPG, then we are going to call encode JPG and we'll pass in that image. Otherwise, if format is equal to PNG, then we'll call encode PNG. And then finally, if anything else, if format is anything else, then we will just print out a message to our user and say, hey, unsupported file type. So I'll print out unsupported file type, like so. Now, of course, when we call encode JPG or encode PNG right here, let's take a look at the documentation for those two functions again. Back over on the image documentation, I'm going to click very quickly over to the function. Let's look at, well, how about encode JPG? So this is going to return back to us a list of integers. And again, this is some very raw data that reflects the contents of the image. So we need to make sure that whenever we call encode JPG or encode PNG right here, we attempt to kind of save the result of that function call. So I'm going to say that I'm going to declare a new variable up here that's going to hold the result of either encode JPG or encode PNG. So I'll make a new variable with the var keyword, and then I will call this, how about new image? And then I'm not going to actually initialize that to any variable. Now the reason that I'm using the var keyword and creating the variable out here is that I want to access this variable right here later on down after these if statements. If I declare this variable right here, then this image variable is only going to be accessible in the scope of these curly braces right here. And so scoping inside of Dart follows very conventional rules around most other programming languages. I have to make sure that I still obey the scope of the variable that's being created. So that's why I declared this out here. It's also why I declared it using the var keyword so that I can reassign a new variable to a new image inside of one of these if statements. If we did something like final, then we would get a little bit of a warning right here that says something like, hey, you're using the final keyword. Whenever you use final, you must initialize it in the same step. which is something that we're not going to do because we do not yet know what we want the value of new image to be. Okay, so in total, we'll do var new image, and then inside of both these if statements, we'll have new image equals and new image equals. So now by the time that I get down here, I will have new image inside of my variable, or excuse me, the image inside of my new image variable. Okay, so that looks good. Let's take another quick break and we'll continue in the next section. We now have the newly encoded image that is now of the specified file type. So we now need to take this image and save it back to our hard drive. So to save a file to our hard drive, let's again take a look at some of our documentation. I'm going to go back over to the file class on the Dart API. So in order to create a new file on our hard drive, we will create a new file object as is shown right here. And then we're going to call a function on the file class instance that we get back called right here, write as bytes sync. So we'll make a new reference or a new instance of a file. We'll then call write as bytes sync, and we'll pass in the list of raw bytes that we want to write in that file. And of course, what we get back from new image right here is a list of integers, or the raw data that the image consists of. So down here towards the bottom, I'm going to say new file. We're going to pass in some very temporary image name. So for right now, I'll just put in gibberish because we're going to come back to that in just a second. And then I'll say write as bytes sync. And I'll pass in new image like so. Okay, so right here, the name or the string that I passed into the file is going to be the name of the file as it shows up on our hard drive. Now, we do probably want to use the same image title. So if we look at the image that we were working on previously, the one that I just downloaded, its name was maxresdefault.jpg. So if I convert this to a PNG, chances are I want to use the same name, but have the new extension of PNG on there. So we need to write a little bit of code to say that rather than using this gibberish right here, I want to take the original file name, which is available on the selected file argument right here. We want to change the extension on that thing, and then we want to pass it in as the new file name. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a new helper function inside this file called replace extension. We're going to call replace extension with a string that is the current file name, which we will call simply path. And then we'll also have a second argument on this that will also be a string that will be the new extension. And so that's going to essentially be the format variable over here. So this is the current file name with its current extension of JPG or PNG or whatever it is, and we want to find that PNG or find that PNG and replace it with a new extension. So then from this overall function, we're going to eventually return a string that is going to be the new function name. And so I'm going to annotate the function return type as being a string. So now inside of here, we're going to return path, and I want to look at that path variable, which again is the file name, and I'm going to call a function on that string called replace all. As you might guess, replace all is going to take some target string that we are looking for, and it's going to replace it with some new string, which for us is going to be this new extension. But the thing to keep in mind here is that at this point in time, we don't really know that much about whether or not the current file name contains PNG or JPG. Now, of course, we could look at new extension right here and assume that if this is JPG, well, chances are we need to look at path and replace PNG in there, right? In other words, we can look at new extension and kind of decide what to do. But I'm going to kind of assume that, maybe we don't want to write a bunch of code to have to look at new extension and decide what to do. So instead, we're going to be a little bit clever here. I'm going to write in a new regular expression for the first argument of replace all. I'll say new reg expression, and I'll put in R with a single quote, another single quote, and then inside there I'm going to put PNG, JPG, and JPEG, and then close that parenthesis. And then finally, as the second argument to this, I'll put in new extension, like so. Okay, so this is a regular expression. it's going to find any instance of the characters PNG, JPG, or JPEG inside of our original file name, and it's going to replace, whenever it finds one of those, with the new extension. And so now we have a very reusable function right here, and we don't have to kind of inspect the value of new extension and decide what to do when it comes to renaming. So again, much more reusable function. All right, so now the last thing we have to do, rather than passing in this gibberish to new file right here, I'm going to pass in the result of calling replace extension. And into replace extension, I'm going to pass the current file name, which is selected file.path. And as a second argument, I'll pass in the new format that we want. Now when I save this file, it's going to wrap a little bit of code, and that's looking pretty good right there. Okay, so I think this looks good. Let's take a quick pause right here, and we'll continue in the next section. In the last section, we got a new file name for our image file. We then created a new file, and then wrote some information into that file. Now, the last thing I want to point out here is that when we call convert image, chances are that we're going to want to return the new file name so that we can then present it on the screen at some point in time and tell the user, hey, we've now successfully converted your image, and here's the name of the new file. So I think that maybe then, rather than just calling replace extension right here and passing the result directly into new file, maybe we should save the new path that comes from this right here and then return it from the overall convert image function. So let's try that out. I'm going to highlight the replace extension call. I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to assign it to a new variable right above it, and I'll call this new path, like so. I'm then going to take that new path variable and pass it into the new file constructor. And then finally at the bottom, I will return new path. So now anytime that someone calls convert image, they're going to get back a string that represents the new name of the file. I'm going to make sure that I annotate the return type of convert image as being a string as well. Okay, so this looks pretty good. I think that we're just about ready to test this out, but the last thing we have to do is make sure that we actually wire it up inside of our main.dart file. So let's again take a very quick break. We'll come back to the next section, and we're going to make sure that our main function is going to call that new convert function with the format and the selected file. Before we actually attempt to test out the image conversion, we need to make sure that we import our brand new converter file that we just put together into our main.dart file and try to actually use the thing inside of here. So at the top, I'm going to add in a little bit of code that's going to attempt to import the src file that we just put together. So I'm going to write out import. We're going to write out the name of our package. Remember, the name of our package is listed inside of the pubspec.yaml file. I had called mine converter. So I'm going to import from package converter. I'm going to go into the src directory and get the converter.dart file. So now down right after we get our format and our selected file, I'm going to call convert image and pass in the selected file and the new format, like so. And then when we call convert image, remember it's going to return the new path or the new name of this file. And so I'm going to store that inside of a variable that I will call new path, like so. I'm going to put these all kind of right next to each other and just kind of group them up like so. Now we're going to eventually make use of new path in a moment, but for right now, let's just kind of test this thing out. So I'm going to save this file. I'm going to go back over to my terminal. Now notice I'm again inside my bin directory, and I'm going to execute dart main.dart. So now I'm asked if I'm here to convert an image. Yes, we are. I'm asked if I want to convert it to a JPG or a PNG. Well, my current image is a JPEG, so I'm probably going to want to convert it to a PNG. So I'll enter 1, and then I'll select the max res default image with 0. So now that converts the image, at least in theory, and then exits the program. If I now list out all my files inside of here, you'll see that I have a new file called maxresdefault.png. I can now open up my Finder inside of here, here's the PNG file that we just created. I can open it up, and sure enough, I see the image just as you would want. Perfect. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. Now, the last thing that we might want to do here, remember that after doing that image conversion, we want to ask our user if we should then open up the image. So, quick break, we'll come back to the next section, and we'll make sure that we add on this very last step. In the last section, we were able to successfully test out the entire image conversion process. Now, the very last thing we have to do is attempt to actually open up the file that was returned. So right after we get back the new path for the image that was just written to our hard drive, we're going to ask our users one last question. We're going to create a new variable right here. We'll call it, how about should open, and this will be the result of calling prompter dot ask binary, and we'll ask them open the image. So now should open is going to be a Boolean value. It'll be true if we do in fact want to open that file up. So I'm going to put down if should open, then we're going to add in a little bit of code right here that's going to open the image itself. Now to open up the image, we're going to be making use of a function from the standard library again. So we'll very quickly go look it up. As usual, I'm back at api.dartlang.org. Inside the Dart.io module, I'm going to find the class on the right-hand side of process right here. And so inside of process, there is something called a static method available to us called run. A static method means that is a function tied to this class, and we can call it directly off the class without making a new instance of it ahead of time. So if we call the run function, we pass in the name of the command that we want to invoke, and then some number of arguments to it, or really precisely a list of arguments. So in order to run this or open up this file, if we were trying to open this thing from the command line, I would write open max res default.png like so. So the command that we're going to run is open, and the only argument that we're going to provide to it is the name of the file or the path to the file that we just created. Okay, so back over here inside my if statement, I'll do process.run. I'll pass in the open command, and then inside of a list, I'm going to add the single argument of new path, like so. All right, so let's try this out one more time. I'll flip back over to my code editor, or excuse me, my terminal. Inside my bin directory, I'll run dart main.dart. I am here to convert an image. Now we already have a JPEG and a PNG, but that's okay. We can just overwrite the ones that already exist there. So I'll say 1. I'm going to select, I don't know, we'll convert the PNG. So it then converts the image. It asks me if I want to open it, and I'll say, yes, I do. And the image is opened for me automatically. Awesome. So that's it. That's the entire application. So I hope you enjoyed putting this together. This is definitely a fun exercise in using an open source module that we already put together and deployed. So let's take a break right here. And this is the kind of appendix section. So if you want to, if you came over here at the very start of the course to brush up on Dart, you can always go back over to the Flutter stuff earlier on. Otherwise, if you're at the very end of the course and you've already gone through everything Flutter related, then I hope you had a good time.